know a little bit more about how your memory works, you may find yourself wondering why you still can't remember things that you want to. Or maybe you're questioning how good your memory really is right now. Today, we are going to get into how to pull things back out of your memory and why, despite all of our best efforts, you're still going to fail sometimes. In the last video, we talked about how information gets into your memory, from your sensory memory to your short-term memory with paying attention, and from your short-term memory holding on to it using maintenance rehearsal or repetition using that phonological loop, and moving things into our long-term memory with our levels of processing theory, deepening or increasing those neural connections, automatic processing of some information, and effortful processing like mnemonic devices and organization that helps move things into our long-term memory as well. When it comes to moving things into our long-term memory, as we said before, that is known as effortful processing. It can also be called elaborative rehearsal, because what we are doing is we're thinking more deeply about the information, and that's going to help us to remember it for a longer period of time. Maintenance rehearsal or repetition can move some things into long-term memory, but we really have to do a lot of maintenance rehearsal to get there, because the goal of maintenance rehearsal is simply to keep things in our short-term or our working memory. Again, think about repeating things over and over again like a phone number. Unless you write that phone number down or do something else to help you to remember it, yes, eventually you may be able to memorize it, but it takes a significantly longer period of time to be able to do that through repetition than it does through that elaborative rehearsal. So again, despite all of our best efforts, our memory doesn't always work the way that we want it to. There are different types of memory disorders that can take place. Sometimes it can actually be remembering more than we originally wanted to. An autobiographical memory is a type of episodic memory that allows you to remember all of the details of your life, which may sound great, but can also have some problems that are associated with it. On the other side of the coin, not being able to remember anything is known as amnesia. And there are two types of amnesia that take place, and this usually happens as a result of some kind of damage, disease, or sometimes psychological trauma. If you were riding your bike one day and you fell off and bumped your head, and you could no longer remember your past, basically everything leading up to the event of falling off your bike, that is referred to as retrograde amnesia. Think retro is the past, you can't remember the past. Some people, on the other hand, experience what's known as anterograde amnesia, which is they can't form new memories. So it would be like falling off your bike and bumping your head. You can still remember everything that happened before that, but from that point on, you can no longer form new memories. So anterograde amnesia is the inability to form new memories. Retrograde amnesia is the inability to remember old memories. And some people can have both, where they can't remember anything at all. And of course, then there's also neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, where specific neurons that produce neurotransmitters that help us in memory start to deteriorate or die away, and that is also going to cause some memory loss that can take place as well. And we've all actually been struck by amnesia at one point in our lives when we were children. Infantile amnesia is the inability to remember things from the early ages of our life. Think back to what you think your first memory really is. Chances are it takes place somewhere between the ages of 2 and 4, because anything before that, we didn't have the ability to encode into our long-term memory. Now, when you are trying to pull something out of your memory, there are a couple of different ways that you can go about it. In the retrieval process, there is both recall and recognition. Recall is trying to kind of blindly pull something out of your memory, or doing so without assistance. Think of recall as like a fill-in-the-blank question on a test where there is no word bank. You are just trying to pull the information directly from your mind in order to remember it. What's significantly easier is recognition. Recognition memory, or recognition retrieval, is where you're simply able to identify the information from your memory. So it's more like a multiple choice question, where all you need to be able to do is recognize the correct answer out of a series of choices. Some things that we can do that can help facilitate memory retrieval, or sometimes things that could also get in the way, are called context-dependent memory. Context-dependent memory is the improved recall that you experience when you are in the same or similar setting as to where that information was encoded. Think about if you've ever walked into a different room of your house to get something, and when you get there, you can't remember why you were there in the first place. But the minute you return to your starting point, all of a sudden the memory comes back to you. You're more likely to remember something when you're in the same place as where that information originated. And that is why psychologists say that you should not study in a location like your bed. Because if you're studying in bed and trying to take a test at a desk, the context is not congruent. And so it might be more difficult to pull that information from your memory. So trying to recreate that experience by studying at a desk, a similar location to where you'll be taking a test, can actually help facilitate the recall. You can also be impacted by your mood or mood congruent memory, where you're more likely to remember things when you're in the same mood as when that information was encoded, or state dependent memory when you're in the same state of consciousness. So hopefully this is never the case, but if you're under the influence of, say, drugs or alcohol, you might not be able to remember something that took place until the next time you are in that same state of consciousness. Finally, the other things that we can do that will help facilitate memory recall and make sure that it can be retrieved at the time we want it to be is the testing effect and metacognition. The testing effect is enhanced memory retrieval when you actually practice retrieving the information as opposed to just rereading the information. When you are studying for a class, for example, instead of simply just going over your notes, going to a fresh page and writing down the information that you remember, seeing what it is that you can actually recall, is testing yourself. And studies show that testing yourself to see what you remember and what you don't, even when you don't remember a lot, you're more likely to remember that information moving forward than if you were to simply just reread that information from the notes that you've already taken. And that goes along with metacognition, where you have to be aware of your own thought process and your own memory. So by asking yourself the question, do I know this or do I not? Do I remember this term or do I not? It's a type of metacognition, but it's also that testing effect. By asking yourself that question and then being able to answer it, again, even if the answer is I don't remember it, changes the way your brain processes that information, that increases the chances that you'll be able to recall it long term. But again, even with all of our best efforts, we're still not going to be able to remember everything. The forgetting curve is a great example of how quickly we lose information. Created by Ebbinghaus, the forgetting curve demonstrates that when we don't do anything with the information we're presented with, we lose the majority of the information within 20 minutes of its presentation. After about a day, most of that information is lost and then it levels out over time. As time goes on, what we have been able to encode into our memory seems to stay there. But if we haven't encoded it in the first place, we don't even have a chance of pulling it back out. Encoding failure is when that information never made its way into our long-term memory to begin with. So we can be exposed to a whole bunch of information. And as we mentioned before with sensory memory, you're exposed to sounds and sights every single day, but only the pieces you pay attention to can get to short term, and only the things you use elaborative rehearsal or effortful processing on are those things that are going to make their way into our long-term memory. And so there is a whole lot that does not get encoded, and if it's not in there, we have no chance of pulling it back out. Even the things that we do put in, though, we might face some challenges in retrieving. One reason could be because of interference. Interference is when information is being blocked. Now, that does not mean it was not ever put into our brain, and it does not mean, like amnesia, we can never pull it back out again. But this might make things more difficult for us as we're trying to retrieve information. Some people are going to be impacted by proactive interference, and proactive interference is when old information gets in the way of recalling new information. So something you learned earlier in the day, and maybe you're still thinking about it, prevents you from being able to remember things that you learned later on in that same day. Other people are impacted by retroactive interference, where the newer information prevents the recall of the older information. In this case, Maybe what you learned towards the end of the day is what you remember, and when you think back on what you learned in school that day, the stuff that happened earlier in the day, you can no longer recall. Some people are going to be affected by proactive, others are going to be affected by retroactive. Sometimes it just depends on the situation. And sometimes that blocking can be very frustrating because you feel like you know the answer to something or you know what something is because it's in your memory. You just can't quite pull it out. If you've ever had that feeling, like trying to find a word and you know what the word is, but you just can't quite say it, that's called the tip of the tongue phenomenon. It's right there, right at the tip of your tongue, trying to come out of your memory. But for some reason, there's some type of block. Could be interference, could be mood, could be state, could be context dependent, that we just can't quite pull it back out. And then we have to deal with the fact that our memories can actually change over time as well. There are different reasons why this happens, but what we have seen in research study after research study is that memories are not just a recording of being played back, these events of our lives. Since not everything can be encoded, because we can't pay attention to everything, our brain tries to fill in gaps of missing pieces of information, and it's not always going to be 100% correct. Sometimes things that other people say can impact our ability to remember things accurately. So if someone asks a question or adds a detail of information to a story, maybe two people are telling the story of the same event, and if you remember them slightly differently, other people's comments or other people's questions might change how you remember that event. If you are a witness to a car accident, for example, and you're interviewed afterwards, and you're asked what color the car was that smashed into the other car, might create a different picture in your head of the memory than if they asked what color was the car that bumped into the other car. That different change in language might change the replaying of that memory in your mind that can actually change the memory overall. Or sometimes we're faced with source amnesia, where we remember something, but we don't necessarily remember where it happened. Maybe you dream about something and think that it happened in real life, or read about it in a book and you think you saw it in a movie. Not being able to remember the source of where it came from, but still having that memory is a type of memory failure. And then of course, there is memory construction. Because as we mentioned, because everything can't be encoded, there are going to be gaps in our memory. So when you replay an event of your life, let's say dining at an Italian restaurant, the last time you were there, you might think that you took in all of the details, the decorations on the wall, the colors of the tablecloth, the items on the menu. But what you're really doing is rebuilding that memory each time, and anything that wasn't encoded, you're filling in those gaps with your schema, with things that most likely were there, that could have happened. Maybe you see pasta dishes on the menu that you think of when you think of Italian restaurants as a whole, even if they weren't actually at that restaurant. When you look at the tablecloth, do you imagine a red and white checkered one that you see at many restaurants, or a white tablecloth that you might see at others? If you don't actually encode it, your brain might just fill in the information with what most likely took place, and it could be correct, but you could also be wrong. And memory consolidation is what happens when memory is stored in the brain. Some things are going to be strengthened, some things are going to be cut, some things could even be changed. And that happens as that memory is utilized over time. And sometimes things that we imagine happening can also make their way into our memory as well. If you've ever gotten into an argument and walked away thinking about the things that you wish you said, or imagining things in a made-up scenario, if you think about it enough, you might start to believe that those things that you wish you said, you actually said, or that those things actually took place. There are examples of false memories that can be created as a result of our own imaginations. So try as we might, and with all of the effort in the world, we can improve our memories. Just know it's not always going to be perfect, and that's okay. And there's probably a good reason for that, as there's some things that are not necessary for us to remember, or maybe things that we don't even want to. So thank you so much for watching, and as always remember, be kind to your mind.